I chose to speak to you during the 24 hours of our 2 channels to clarify your position on our commitment to Ukraine. On February 26, after an international conference, you stunned everyone by refusing to rule out sending Western troops to Ukraine. A few days later, you called on Europeans not to be cowards. Finally, you stated that there were no limits, no red lines to French support for Kiev. So, have we understood you correctly? Are you considering sending Western French troops to Ukraine?
Good evening and welcome. You're sitting in front of me. Are you standing? No. Are you ruling out standing up at the end of this interview? Of course you're not going to rule it out. You won't rule it out. There you go. We're not sure we'll do it. But in any case, we're not in that situation today.
It's not a question of life or death. It's a question of sitting or dying.
No, but first, there's a gradation, and it depends where you're doing it. I make this comparison to explain what it means not to exclude options. There's a reason for not doing it. And the position of simply saying what we're doing and giving ourselves red lines. What's the situation? For the last 10 years, because this all started in 2014, Russia launched a war of aggression against Ukraine. Then we did everything we could to establish peace. Everything. The Minsk agreements, the negotiations conducted under the aegis of France and Germany with Ukraine and Russia, right here, in this very room. The only meeting between President Zelensky and President Putin on the 9th of December at the end of the year. And Russia, the Kremlin regime once again decided for itself in February 2002 to launch the second stage of this offensive, a full-scale war against Ukraine. And not just the Donbass, because he's not telling us his limits. He regularly bombs Kiev, attacks Odessa, and so on. We have an objective. Russia cannot and must not win this war. For 2 years, we've been helping Ukraine. And if things were to get out of hand, it would once again be Russia's sole responsibility. Russia's responsibility. And so if we decide today to be weak, if faced with someone who has no limits, faced with someone who has crossed all the limits he gave us, we naively say to him, I won't go any further than this or that. At that point, we're not deciding peace. We're already deciding defeat.
And you decide to say it, to send it, and that's a very strong gesture to decide to say that we might go that far.
I accept, and I assume it because it's the role of the President of the Republic in our institutions. The President of the Republic is in charge of national defense. He doesn't make comments. He makes decisions for the safety of the French people. What is at stake in Ukraine? A war that is existential for our Europe and for France. I hope we'll come back to it, because it's a key issue, subject. And so I've decided, because after 2 years of war, I want to remind you that we have systematically done what we said we weren't going to do, which also puts into perspective the very definitive statements sometimes made by some people across Europe. 2 years ago, we said we'd never send a tank. We did. 2 years ago, we said we would never send medium-range missiles. We did. We said we'd never send planes. Some are in the process of doing so. So, we've put too many limits, if I may say so, on our vocabulary. We're not escalating. We are not at war with Russia. Quite simply, we must be clear. We must not let Russia win.
But the French haven't understood, you were talking about vocabulary, under what precise, concrete conditions French soldiers would go to fight in Ukraine. Was it because the Russian army would make a decisive breakthrough on the front line? Is it because a key city, Odessa, for example, is about to fall? You weren't specific on that.
But perhaps I'm right not to be precise, and I'll say it again.
But the two conditions I've just mentioned are either science fiction or possible scenarios.
In your eyes. For some years now, we've all been living in a world where what we thought unthinkable is happening. This is the end of the carefree attitude I mentioned a few years ago. This is it. War is on European soil. Between Strasbourg and Lviv, less than 1,500 kilometers. Just imagine war is in this country. So it's not a fiction and it's not far from us. So, all these options are possible. The only one who will take responsibility is the Kremlin regime. It won't be us. We will never go on the offensive. We will never take the initiative. France is a force for peace. But today, to have peace in Ukraine, we must not be weak. And so we have to look at the situation lucidly and say, with determination, will, and courage, that we are ready to do whatever it takes to achieve our objective, which is that Russia should not win.
If we're ready, it's because we're getting ready. That means right now...
In the beginning, we're getting ready.
That means we're training for air operations or...
But France on the ground...
On the ground?
France didn't wait until February 2002 to get ready. We have a complete army model, a deterrent force and operational armies. And I would like to take this opportunity to pay tribute once again to our soldiers and their families. We are one of the few countries in Europe that for 10 years has had forces deployed in the Sahel to fight terrorism. And we have lost dozens of men there.
But for you, it wasn't the same kind of fight.
But did we think it was?
Got the Islamists
we were fighting issues.
Who were
we were fighting terrorists who were...
Domestic enemies too.
At the request of a state to prevent a sovereign state from collapsing and to protect our outposts. But do we think it's more incidental? Today, it's not necessary in Ukraine. But does that mean we should rule out everything? What I mean is that we're ready. That's why I decided in my first term of office, and right from the start, a considerable increase in the budget for our armed forces, which means that the 2 military programming laws that I would have had to decide as president would have led to a doubling of the budget for our armed forces. So we're not waking up on this subject. I'd just like to clarify one point. What has happened over the last few months is a profound change, and the leap forward that I called for on February 16, alongside President Zelensky here, and which led me to say this, but above all to decide on very concrete things with our allies, is that the Ukrainian counteroffensive has not gone as expected over the last few months. And when you look at the situation over the last few weeks, it's a difficult situation on the ground for the Ukrainians. That's an understatement. That's an understatement. Some experts say that I'm not being defeatist, but it's difficult. They're brave, once again. But they have limits. They have limits in terms of men. Because Russia is a bigger country, and as soon as there are only Ukrainian men, they have this limit, and they lose a lot of them. And they have a limit in terms of shells and missiles, because just about now, when Russia fires 10 shells, we respond with 1. So you can see that the situation on the front is very fragile. And next to that, you have a regime in the Kremlin that has hardened profoundly.
Because what's the difference?
All these last months, and I would say in gradation, the informational and cyber attacks, including in our daily lives on hospitals in France and elsewhere in Europe, which has hardened by deciding to kill political opponents.
But this is nothing
Alexei
new.
Lavallee, but I'm not saying it's us. I'm saying it's intensifying.
But the alarm could have been sounded earlier. That's what I mean.
You can't blame me for sounding the alarm too early, and you can't blame me for sounding it earlier. I believe that as I look at the situation with a clear head, we have done everything we could beyond sounding the alarm to be demanding. But the agreements with President Putin, the clear head that I am evoking in front of you, I have been wearing since the June of June in Versailles, saying, you're attacking us. You're manipulating our data. I was a victim of this in my first campaign. So we need to establish respect and stop you being a destabilizing force. I'll say it again in 2008, in 2009, but back then we wanted to avoid war. Then there was the time when we helped Ukraine to resist. But now the situation on the ground in Ukraine is changing. The situation is much more difficult for them. Russia is getting tougher at home and stepping up its attacks. And so, yes, I say to you with the utmost solemnity, this beginning of the year, 2024, must be, for us, one of startup.
If we send soldiers over there, forgive me for remaining in this gloomy scenario, there'll be infantrymen, conscripts and airmen.
Okay, so we don't talk about it. But first of all, I don't wish it. I want Russia to stop this war, withdraw from its positions and allow peace. But you no longer believe that. But what's important here is, firstly, it's not my wish, but secondly, I'm not going to give visibility to someone who doesn't give it to me. That's a question for President Putin. Come on. But he asked me where I thought the number was today.
Your Minister of the Armed Forces gave us some visibility. He said, no, we're not sending any men over there.
We don't know.
It may be minors.
We don't know.
That's what we expected.
I can tell you this because he made a distinction between what was decided and what we're putting in place and what we shouldn't exclude because we'll adapt. We have decided, last February 26 in Paris, to set up a coalition to supply them with missiles or bombs that will enable them to hit Russia alone, but never Russia, but to reach behind Russian positions today. We also decided to speed up our search for ammunition wherever it was available. That's what I went to Prague to do a few days later, and we decided to carry out 5 joint actions, and we all agreed around this table, Europeans, Americans, Canadians, Brits, to say we're going to clear mines together, produce and repair equipment, deploy civilian forces on the border with Belarus, protect the border with Moldavia, again with civilian forces, and defensive cyber actions on Ukrainian soil.
On the other hand, they have not decided to send any troops at all. And they let you know as soon as you said that.
We can always come back to that, and I'm going to get to the bottom of it.
That's what the French are asking.
But they're absolutely right. But I say today, we've decided on this, and it's a change. We decided it in Paris. It's the start of a new awakening. Then, I tell you, we'll do what's necessary to achieve our goal. Because if Russia were to win, French people's lives would change. How would it change? We would no longer have security in Europe. Who can think for a second that President Putin, who has not respected any commitments, would stop there?
What's happening in Ukraine today also affects France's vital interests. There is a danger,
but the security of
France,
Europe and the security of the French are at stake over there. And these are our vital interests. You're using a term that has particular connotations. I say security.
And you yourself have used the term existential threat.
But
that means it's our very existence that's at stake in the game.
Say it and I assume it. We've already suffered the consequences of this war in our daily lives. We've already suffered these attacks. Many of our hospitals have already suffered days and days of dysfunction due to Russian aggression. We've already suffered the consequences in Europe. The price of gas, the situation of our economy, the cost of cereals, the economic upheavals that have followed are the consequence of this war launched by Russia. And if Russia wins this war, Europe's credibility will be reduced to zero. Will be reduced to zero. What would be the credibility on our soil of a power, the European Union, of its members who let this happen? What would be the security of Europeans? Do you think that the Poles, the Lithuanians, the Estonians, the Latvians, the Romanians, the Bulgarians could remain at peace for a second? And I'm not even talking about Moldavia, which may not be in the European Union today, but which would be threatened in a second.
You're saying it in a nutshell.
I say it's happening.
Putin won't stop there. If he wins this war, he'll continue elsewhere. He'll find other prey.
By
Is
us,
that what you're saying?
but by our past. We've already seen regimes that killed opponents at home, had authoritarian tendencies, and were determined to conquer everything they were allowed to conquer.
So Putin wouldn't stop there if he won this war.
But I think what I'm saying is a complete consensus from President Biden to the German Chancellor, everything.
All the leaders of
What I'm
Europe,
saying
so
here-
only our force, French, European, NATO, I don't know, can stop it. And it has to be stopped in Ukraine.
Today we need to have, to borrow an old Churchill phrase, the nerve of peace. To want peace is not to choose defeat. To want peace today is not to abandon Ukraine. Is it to wage war?
That's what they're asking you to do.
No. It's to be credible, to be strong and ready. To adapt to whatever choice Russia makes. And so, if war were to spread to Europe, it would be Russia's sole choice and sole responsibility. But to decide today to be weak, to decide today that we would not respond, is already defeat. Sir, don't
Why
say
can't
it.
you say
I
so?
don't want you to. But contrary to what you'd like to believe, many of my counterparts have followed my lead. A few days later,
you're not
I was
on your
in
way to
Prague,
finding out.
and next to me was the president. Czech said exactly the same thing. You had the Lithuanian president here a few days ago, he said himself. All options must be open. He even obtained a mandate from his parliament to send.
That means you've convinced
But
them.
things
You're
are
in the
moving.
process of getting
But
the
as we've
states
done
on
every
board.
time, in February 2082, in March 2082, in Versailles, we decided on a strategic agenda, the agenda for Europe's strategic autonomy. It's still called the Versailles Agenda. It is still valid, and we have been in the vanguard. We debated the possibility of recognizing Ukraine's application to join the European Union. To join the European Union. Not many people were there. 2 months later, I took the train to Kiev with Chancellor Scholz, Prime Minister Draghi, and the President of Romania. Zelensky, that we were for it, and we decided at the next council meeting that this would be the case. Things are moving. We simply have to. And because it's my responsibility, do I want to give you the finger? My responsibility is the security of the French people and national defense. And our security is also at stake in Ukraine today.
By the way, today, March 24, is the Russian regime, Vladimir Putin's regime, France's enemy?
He is the adversary.
What is the semantic nuance between adversary and
enemy? We are not at war with Russia.
Yeah, but it is waging war on us. So you want it to be
We're
one?
attacking on a cyber level, yes.
But it's a form of war. Russian agents hired by Russia, who were Moldovans, tagged photos of David in Paris.
You're right to say all that, which is a hybrid form. But we have to be careful not to qualify them immediately, because otherwise we'd be ourselves.
What would it take for you to say the word enemy? What would sympathy
But if Russia were to escalate again, dragging us all into a conflict, I wish with all my might that it wouldn't. But for sure, today we're in a situation where we can't afford to lose. But today, Russia is certainly an adversary. The Kremlin regime is an adversary, but I've always said it. We are not waging war against Russia and the Russian people. And we support Ukraine. We are doing everything we can to help it defeat Russia. Russia in check because, let me put it very simply, there can be no lasting peace if there isn't sovereignty and a return to the internationally recognized borders, including Crimea. But it's up to the Ukrainians to decide. It's up to them to negotiate.
To discuss it.
And you're right to say so.
After all.
It's theirs.
You're right.
It's their
country.
country.
It is their country. It's got internationally recognized
But what
borders.
I'm saying is that there will be no security and no lasting peace if it's not the fruit of negotiation led by the Ukrainians. But there will be no security for the French if there is no peace there.
You say it's not allowed.
Peace doesn't mean Ukraine's capitulation, nor the amputation of Ukraine, because all that is already choosing that we are weak. So France's position has been very consistent from the outset. It's just that Russia is escalating. And to this escalation, we must say that we are ready to respond.
Would Russia be capable of targeting you? You recently cancelled the visit to Ukraine for security reasons.
Not at all.
That's what, obviously...
That's what Russia said. Don't believe them. You know, Russia... It's interesting because public debate is permeated by Russian misinformation. They made people believe it. Many people are now convinced. The subject of ground troops has entered the public debate. One of your colleagues asked me this question, because the Slovak Prime Minister, who is very close to Russia says that our secret plan is to send ground troops. And we react every time. We close doors, we hunker down. No. So I postponed my trip. Why did you do that? Because President Zelensky was coming to Europe for the Munich Security Conference. So I suggested that he come here to sign the bilateral agreement. And then I told him, on the strength of the very long discussion we'd had and the lucid assessment I've just made, I told him, in essence, my usefulness, rather than being at your side in Kiev, is to implement this leap of faith, to convince the Europeans and our allies to go further. What we have done here, the 26, with these new initiatives that have been taken, is to try to go further, and precisely to make everyone realize that things are changing, and changing fast, and not in the right direction. And that's what I'll be taking to Berlin tomorrow, where I'll be meeting Chancellor Scholz and the Polish Prime Minister.
Almost every week, Russian President Vladimir Putin brandishes the nuclear threat in a clear and threatening manner. France is the only member of the European Union to have nuclear weapons. Do you, or should we, feel particularly targeted?
First and foremost, we need to feel particularly protected, precisely because we are this endowed power.
Except that he mentions France a lot.
And that this is the very meaning of the choice made by General de Gaulle after the Second World War. And then we are ready, we have an established doctrine, and when it comes to nuclear power, you don't need many words. And nuclear power is not an instrument of destabilization or threat. It's an instrument
And the
of
fact
security.
that we have the bomb, as Russia does, places us in a special confrontation, giving France a greater responsibility or greater weight, depending on your point of view.
First and foremost, our nuclear capability provides security for the French people, which few countries in the world have. It gives us a responsibility to be a power with this weapon, and therefore to never escalate, either verbally or, of course, de facto.
And yet he brandishes the threat.
I don't
And
think
he
it's
echoes your words about red lines.
appropriate when nuclear weapons,
You haven't spoken to Putin in how long?
several months.
Isn't it a handicap not to speak to him?
Look, I've talked to him. I've spoken to him whenever necessary. I've talked to her, obviously hundreds of hours, before February 2022, at length between February and April 2022, to try to stop this war and negotiate peace. But from the moment he himself no longer respected any framework, in other words, contrary to what he had said, he was not carrying out a special operation, which we had already condemned, and that he had no legal framework, no legitimacy, no legality, but that he would attack Kiev, which was carrying out war crimes. The discussion no longer made sense.
We're
going to go on like we did in September. Then there were occasional discussions on the nuclear issue, because we had taken the initiative because of the front line in conjunction with the International Atomic Energy Agency to do everything we could to protect this plant. And so I had the exchanges at that time. But discussions, I'm perfectly willing to have them at any time. But we still need to be dealing with someone who is telling the truth and whose intention is to make peace. And that's not the case today.
And in your opinion, Vladimir Putin is a Russian patriot? Is he an autocrat? Is he a dictator? Everything you've been saying for the last 2 minutes, the crimes he's committing against civilians, we look in a dictionary, we say to ourselves that only an autocrat or a dictator can commit crimes against civilians.
Today, I'm not a commentator. The president of the Russian Federation, who today is caught up in a drift.
Personal or repressive.
And authoritarian drift in his country, and has chosen in recent years to be a power of destabilization, to be a destabilizing power in Europe. In Europe, by launching a war for which it bears sole responsibility and threatening the security of all. But in many other theaters of operation, from the Near and Middle East to the Caucasus and Africa, Russia is a destabilizing power.
You don't talk to her anymore, so it won't be you who negotiates peace with him. Who will? Will it be the United States?
But there is an order of times. I'm probably the most talked about leader in terms of responsibility.
Yes, but now let's say there's a certain coldness between you.
But it's not a cold, things aren't personal. And besides, I don't want to try and personalize them, it wouldn't make any sense. This isn't fiction, it's not a novel or a series.
And don't worry,
we're talking about life and death. As far as I'm informed, I don't feel that Donald Trump is president of the United States of America.
There's a risk.
And so today it's clear there's not a risk, there's war. As we speak, men and women are dying in Ukraine by President Putin. And what I'm telling you is that if Ukraine falls, our security is threatened. And so the time has come for us to resist. And we're in a time, and this is the time I'm taking on, to say that if Russia were to continue its escalation, if the situation were to deteriorate, we have to be ready. And we will be ready.
And to be ready.
And we will be ready.
And
we'll be ready to
necessary.
make the decisions to ensure that Russia never wins.
Which is why you said that France is in a war economy.
Will come, I hope, as soon as possible, the moment when we will have to speak again with the president of the Russian Federation, whoever he may be, when the time comes.
And France is in a war economy, you said at the beginning of the year. You were talking about shells earlier. Take a look at the figures with Anne-Sophie. As we speak, France is producing less than 100 shells a day, unless we're mistaken. That's what Ukrainian soldiers are using. Used in a few minutes. Sorry, it's very modest, but it's the most we can do.
It's modest, and it's quite normal for these categories because we don't have a defense industry that's adapted to an ever-increasing demand. We don't have a defense industry that is adapted to a war of high territorial intensity, which is not in any of our forecasts and which we are not preparing to wage for ourselves. Will it ever be? And so, several things. Firstly, as early as February 2022, I declared to all industrialists that we were moving into a wartime economy. I asked them to make an effort to produce more and to produce faster. And that's what I entrusted to the Minister of the Armed Forces at that time. We got the job done on several segments that were essential for the Ukrainians. Caesar cannons, which are crucial to Ukraine's defense, we increased their production. And where we have delivered a few dozen since the beginning of the conflict this year, because we have multiplied the lines and increased production rates, we are going to produce almost 75 Caesar cannons, all of which will go to the Ukrainian front. That's a lot more than we've delivered since the beginning. We have more than tripled our production. Categories of shells and missiles that are relevant to the Ukrainians. But there are limits, and this is true of all European countries. So what do we do about it? We're increasing our capacities and production rates, but above all, it's taking time because we have to create new lines and new production structures. That's why we decided to create them in Ukraine, because it's closer to the field and can be done much faster. That's what we decided here with all our partners. And that's what we're going to do, hand in hand with Germany.
Expose you to bombardment.
That's been agreed. You underline a form of contradiction, perhaps, among some of my partners who are ready to produce them on Ukrainian soil, but not ready to make certain commitments for the future. Well, that'll come.
We could be French engineers, but our questions
we're in the
are
process
for
of looking
Ukrainian
into,
Muslims.
within the framework of these coalitions, the deployments we'll be making in Ukraine to co-produce with them. This will help us to move ahead more quickly. And finally, we're doing two other things, one in the short term and one in the medium term. That's what war economics is all about. In the short term, we look for ammunition wherever it's available. So we're going to sound out every country in the world. I won't mention their names here because for some, confidentiality is important. But we'll search their available stock and offer to buy from them because it's a question of speed. At the same time, we're putting the European defense industry in a position to produce much more in the long term.
How do you finance it? Because we're having a bit of a budgetary problem at the moment. We're making a lot of savings.
Yes, but
billions.
because...
How do we finance this whole war effort?
But first of all, I'm going to be very frank with our compatriots and with you. We can't say that we've all been doing it for 2 years. And we've been saying it, all European leaders have been saying it, all of them, there's no exception. Our future is at stake in this war. This war is existential. And to say, we're going to carry on living as if nothing had happened. No, but I'm telling you, that's not possible.
How we finance...
So, as I'm telling you, we've already anticipated the situation since we have a military programming law that comes after the other one. We have doubled our disarmament budget. On top of that, we've been making budgetary choices since 2002. On top of that, we're financing aid to Ukraine.
And
we've already financed 4.8 billion euros, more or less, and we're going to go up to 3 billion euros this year. And then is our European commitment. That's why we've launched a European Peace Facility. It will be approved next week by the European Council, and it provides for the award of contracts to our defense industrialists to produce on our soil, produce more armaments for us, for our eastern flank, and for Ukraine. And we're going to use this money. We're also going to use the money we have in the investment program to go and produce in Ukraine with the Ukrainians. So Europe is also mobilizing alongside our national investment. And on top of that, we shouldn't exclude the possibility of that we'll have to make additional decisions as Europeans. Additional decisions in Europe, and
in other words,
i.e. to decide to finance new initiatives.
With loans?
And I don't rule it out. And I think that what we were able to do during the COVID period, which was to say we're facing a shock, this pandemic, we're all affected. And we need to raise money together on the markets, putting our signature on the table. That's what kept us going. And that's what enabled us to get back on our feet. Personally, I think that if the needs were to be greater, and this is a proposal that has been made by the Prime Minister of Estonia, not a French proposal, but I subscribe to it. And so I think that what I want you to understand from the start of our conversation, and basically for the last 10 days, and what I want our compatriots to understand, there is only one party responsible for the situation we find ourselves in. It's the Kremlin regime. But we have a responsibility, and I say this in all conscience as President of the Republic.
Do you want
it is,
to
I tell you conscientiously, but it will never be... Have you seen the polls?
Have you seen the polls? The support has continued, but...
War in Ukraine. You know, we've been through it at other times in our history. It's always much easier to go and sing nursery rhymes to people. I could tell you tonight, because it's not popular. You know, it's a long way off. We're for peace. We're for peace. The people who say that today, the same people who don't want to support Ukraine, by the way, they're not choosing peace.
Who are you talking about?
They're choosing defeat. A few days ago, they chose to give up their sovereignty because they chose right now to say that we have limits. And so, to the one who, until now, has had none, has taken all the responsibility for aggression, we'll let you move forward because we're afraid.
Because they fear your fear. Who are you talking about?
And those in France?
Ukraine. But at last?
Well, very clearly, have decided not to support Ukraine.
Mr. President, a few days ago, the Senate and the National Assembly had to vote on a security agreement you signed with the Ukrainian president. Several political parties abstained or voted against. The National Assembly abstained, and the Communist Party and France Insoumise voted against. What do you think of their position? They're pacifists and have every right to be. They are instruments of the Kremlin, useful idiots, as we might have said a few decades ago.
No, I've always tried to keep the country united right from the start. The meetings I held in Saint-Denis, I did so again when I saw all the party leaders and the presidents of the constitutional assemblies were held a few months ago. Constitutional assemblies a few days ago. And after that, it's freedom, it's political pluralism, so we have to be respectful of that. But I have a very profound disagreement. I think that today, in good conscience, choosing to abstain or to vote against support for Ukraine is not choosing peace, it's choosing defeat. And that's very different.
And when they accuse you of instrumentalizing the conflict in Ukraine?
We've already had this debate.
In the service of domestic
We've already
politics.
had this debate. Finally, because the last presidential election was held a few months after the start of the February conflict in Kiev. Listen to this. You can't be serious. That's all I can say. It's not serious because the responsibility for this war, the responsibility for the blows to the Ukrainian front, is Russia's alone. Our responsibility is to be strong for peace. Our responsibility is to hold this European unity together. And every time we have achieved European unity, from the outset, we were under the French presidency, and we'll get it, you'll see. It's about holding on to our unity, but it's also about being strong. It means being strong to deter. It means being strong to resist. It's about being strong for our security.
Mr. President, this interview is devoted to the war in Ukraine, but there's another war we can't avoid talking about. It's taking place in Gaza. There will probably be 30,000 deaths. The circumstances on the ground are atrocious. Since the terrorist attacks in Israel on October 7th, you've always said that you're behind Israel and that Israel has the absolute right to defend itself. Does Israel have the right to defend itself to the point of revenge? What do you think of the Israeli army's action today in the Gaza Strip?
Words being important, I never said that Israel had an absolute right. France has
right to defend itself, that's
absolute
what you
right.
said.
Yes, that's right.
And in the first place,
but absolute has
right.
a meaning, and I never said the word. Absolute. France's position has been consistent from the outset. And here again, we were perhaps alone at one point last October when we were joined by others. First of all, we implacably condemned the massive terrorist attack launched by Hamas against Israel and its people.
Then you called for a coalition against
Secondly,
Hamas. That didn't go down too well for the time
You'll
being.
excuse me, but we're all in the process of dissolving associations that finance.
The international coalition
but it's
against
to say,
Hamas.
Fighting Hamas isn't just your story. You, the Israeli leader, it's also ours. And so we must act. What are we doing today with several partners? We're cutting funding wherever it exists. We've dissolved associations, so we're doing it, I assure you.
The other countries didn't really understand at first what the intention was.
The best way, not to get in the way, is to say nothing or simply what the masses want to say. This is not France's position, nor has it ever been throughout our history. Our position, if you'll allow me to express it, is simple. Firstly, implacable, clear condemnation of the attack. Secondly, we said, Israel's security is not just your business, which also means you can't conduct your defense under all conditions, but we are ready to cooperate. For example, on financing, which is what I said right away, to fight against the mass. Secondly, you are a democracy, so you have a responsibility to respect humanitarian law, the laws of war and international law. And that's why, back in October, France called for a truce. That's why we were the first European country to bring a resolution to the Security Council, with several countries in the region. Jordan, United Arab Emirates, to call for a ceasefire. That's why, in October, we organized here the only humanitarian conference in support of the Palestinian people and Israel. For the Palestinian people and one king, officially calling for a ceasefire. And the third component is a political response, because the security of the entire region of Israel, of the Palestinian people, and of all the states in the region is for there to be a political response to the Palestinians' legitimate right to a state.
3 French hostages have been held by Hamas for over 5 months. Are they alive? Do you know where they are? Are you negotiating, or is an intermediary negotiating their release?
Thank you for raising this subject, which is so important to us. We have fought hard with Qatar and Egypt in particular, to secure the release of our hostages who have been freed in recent months. We still have 3 hostages. I'm not going to say anything tonight, as you'll understand. Discussions are underway, and only the families have been informed. Discussions are ongoing. We're putting a lot of energy into this, and I'd like to thank the partners I mentioned. And that we will obtain these releases. It's essential for us. And I hope that in addition to the French hostages, all the hostages, Israeli hostages and hostages around the world, because this is an unacceptable practice, and lives shattered and confiscated. In any case, over there too, we will do everything we can for peace and security for all. This is the meaning of the initiative we have raised, and we are doing everything we can to once again call for a ceasefire.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for answering our questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Have a great evening. Thank you very much.